History is noisy when it makes noise. It ends in silence. On a summer night in 1918, in an unnamed house in the Ural region, an empire that had existed for over 300 years lay comfortably, without a funeral, without a declaration, without official witnesses. No throne, no dynasty, only darkness, gunshots, and a question that will illuminate centuries later: how does power disappear when it believes itself to be eternal? History rarely announces its endings. Empires do not fall in a single moment, nor do dynasties collapse with a clear sound of finality. Instead, they erode slowly, often invisibly, long before the world realizes that their time has passed. The fall of the Romanov dynasty was not an accident of revolution alone. It was the culmination of centuries of accumulated power, isolation, and belief in permanence, beliefs that, once unchallenged, eventually became fatal. For more than 300 years, the Romanovs ruled Russia as absolute monarchs. Their authority was not merely political but sacred, bound to the Russian Orthodox Church and reinforced by tradition, ritual, and fear. The Tsar was not simply a ruler. He was perceived as God's anointed guardian of the Russian land. This fusion of throne and faith created an empire that appeared immovable, even as the world around it transformed at unprecedented speed. By the late 19th century, the Russian Empire stretched across 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. It encompassed vast forests, frozen tundra, industrializing cities, and rural villages where life had changed little for centuries. On the surface, this empire projected strength. Beneath it, however, lay profound contradictions. Russia was attempting to enter the modern age while still anchored to feudal structures that no longer functioned. The tension between these realities would prove decisive. The Romanov dynasty had emerged in 1613, during one of Russia's darkest periods, the time of troubles. Their ascent to power symbolized restoration and stability after chaos. Over generations, the Romanovs reinforced their rule through centralized authority, suppression of dissent, and the cultivation of loyalty among the nobility. Reform, when it came, was cautious and tightly controlled. Change was tolerated only when it did not threaten the supremacy of the crown. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 was one such reform. It freed millions of peasants from legal bondage, yet it failed to grant them true economic independence or political voice. Land was scarce, debt was crushing, and resentment simmered quietly across the countryside. The reform solved a moral problem, but left the structural injustices of Russian society intact. Into this fragile landscape stepped Nicholas II, the final emperor of the Romanov line. He ascended the throne in 1894, inheriting an empire already strained by industrial unrest, political radicalism, and social inequality. Nicholas II did not seek power aggressively, he accepted it as duty. Yet duty alone was insufficient in a time that demanded vision, flexibility, and political courage. Nicholas II believed deeply in autocracy. He was raised to see compromise as weakness and constitutional limits as betrayal. This conviction, shared and reinforced by his wife, Empress Alexandra Fedorovna, isolated the imperial family from both the people and the emerging political realities of Europe. Alexandra's unwavering faith in divine authority and her distrust of reformist voices within Russia further deepened the divide between the monarchy and society. While the imperial court maintained its rituals and ceremonies, Russian cities were changing rapidly. Factories expanded, urban populations grew, and with them came new ideas: socialism, liberalism, and revolutionary thought. Workers endured long hours, dangerous conditions, and minimal wages. Intellectuals questioned the moral legitimacy of absolute rule. Students organized, published, and protested. The empire was no longer silent beneath the crown. The Romanovs, accustomed to ruling through distance, failed to recognize that loyalty sustained by fear cannot endure indefinitely. The silence of the masses was misinterpreted as obedience, when in fact it masked frustration and despair. Each unaddressed grievance added weight to a system already struggling to hold itself together. By the dawn of the 20th century, Russia stood at a crossroads. It possessed immense resources, a powerful military, and a monarchy rooted in centuries of tradition. Yet it lacked the institutional flexibility necessary to adapt. The empire was strong in appearance, fragile in structure. The crown still rested upon the head of the Tsar, but its weight was becoming unbearable. This was not yet the moment of collapse. It was the moment before inevitability became visible. The forces that would destroy the Romanov dynasty were already in motion, gathering strength quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when history would no longer hold the throne in place. At the turn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire still appeared formidable to the outside world. Its borders remained vast, its army immense, its ruler crowned by tradition older than many European states. Yet strength, when measured only by size and ceremony, can be dangerously misleading. Beneath the imperial surface, Russia was entering a period in which pressure would no longer dissipate quietly. It would accumulate, distort, and eventually rupture the very structures meant to contain it. The Romanov system was built on the assumption that authority flowed in a single direction from the throne downward. Political participation was not a right but a concession, granted sparingly and withdrawn without warning. This model had endured for centuries, precisely because Russia had remained isolated from the forces that transformed Western Europe. By 1900, that isolation no longer existed. Railways, factories, newspapers, and universities connected Russian society in ways the autocracy neither anticipated nor controlled. Industrialization, promoted by the state to strengthen the empire, produced consequences it could not manage. Urban workers lived in overcrowded districts, laboring 12 or 14 hours a day under conditions that offered neither safety nor dignity. Strikes became more frequent, not because workers believed revolution was inevitable, but because survival demanded resistance. Each strike, each petition, chipped away at the myth of the Tsar as the benevolent protector of his people. At the same time, Russia's ambitions abroad exposed the fragility of its institutions. In 1904, the empire entered the Russo-Japanese War, convinced that a quick victory would reinforce national unity and restore confidence in the monarchy. Instead, the war revealed deep structural weaknesses. Russian forces were poorly supplied, poorly coordinated, and led by an officer corps selected more for loyalty than competence. Defeat followed defeat, culminating in the destruction of the Baltic Fleet at Tsushima, a loss that shocked the nation and humiliated the regime. Military failure had consequences far beyond the battlefield. It shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility and emboldened critics across the political spectrum. Liberals demanded constitutional reform. Socialists called for systemic change, and even conservative elements within the bureaucracy questioned the wisdom of unchecked autocracy. For the first time in generations, dissent was no longer confined to whispers. The breaking point arrived not in the halls of power, but in the streets of St. Petersburg. On January 9, 1905, thousands of workers marched peacefully toward the Winter Palace, carrying religious icons and portraits of the Tsar. They were led by a priest, Father Georgy Gapon, who believed that direct appeal to the monarch might ease the suffering of the poor. The marchers did not come as revolutionaries. They came as subjects seeking mercy. What followed became known as Bloody Sunday. Imperial troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd. Hundreds were killed or wounded. The massacre did not merely end a demonstration. It destroyed a foundational belief. The image of the Tsar as a distant but caring father figure collapsed in a single day. From that moment on, the monarchy was no longer shielded by reverence. The aftermath of Bloody Sunday triggered a wave of unrest that swept across the empire. Strikes paralyzed industries, peasants attacked estates, and mutinies erupted within the armed forces. The most famous of these, aboard the battleship Potemkin, symbolized a deeper crisis. The state could no longer rely on unquestioned obedience, even from those sworn to defend it. Faced with mounting chaos, the imperial government responded not with structural reform, but with reluctant concessions. In October 1905, Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and the creation of a legislative assembly, the Duma. To many observers, this appeared to mark a turning point, a moment when Russia might transition toward constitutional monarchy. In reality, the manifesto was an act of containment rather than transformation. The Tsar retained ultimate authority, and the Duma's powers were carefully limited. Electoral laws were manipulated to favor conservative interests, and whenever the assembly challenged imperial prerogatives, it was dissolved. Reform existed on paper, but autocracy remained intact at its core. This pattern crisis, followed by half measures, would define the final years of Romanov rule. Each concession postponed collapse but deepened mistrust. The monarchy believed it had preserved order. Society understood that nothing fundamental had changed. The gap between ruler and ruled widened into something no longer bridgeable by tradition alone. By 1906, Russia had survived revolution in name, but not in substance. The empire continued, the crown remained, and ceremonies resumed. Yet the illusion of permanence had been broken. Power, once unquestioned, now required force to sustain it. And force, when used repeatedly against one's own people, carries a cost that history always demands to be paid. After the upheaval of 1905 subsided, the Russian Empire entered a deceptive period of calm. The streets grew quieter, factories resumed operation, and the machinery of the state continued to function. To the imperial court, this appeared to confirm a long-held belief that unrest could be managed through repression, partial reform, and time. Yet this calm was not stability. It was exhaustion. The forces that had erupted were not defeated, they were merely waiting. Nicholas II interpreted survival as vindication. The monarchy had endured revolution once, and in doing so, the Tsar convinced himself that autocracy remained both viable and necessary. The lesson he drew was not that Russia required transformation, but that firmness, surveillance, and control were sufficient to preserve order. This misreading of history would become one of the defining errors of his reign. The years following 1905 were marked by contradiction. On one hand, Russia experienced economic growth. Industrial output increased, rail networks expanded, and cities continued to swell with new workers. On the other hand, political repression intensified. The secret police monitored activists relentlessly, censorship tightened, and revolutionary leaders were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Reform existed only within boundaries the state could dominate. The Duma, conceived as a symbol of constitutional progress, became a stage for confrontation rather than cooperation. When deputies challenged imperial authority, Nicholas II dissolved the assembly without hesitation. Electoral laws were revised to dilute the influence of workers and peasants, ensuring conservative dominance. What remained was a parliament stripped of legitimacy in the eyes of those it claimed to represent. Meanwhile, the imperial family retreated further inward. Nicholas II increasingly withdrew from public engagement, finding solace in routine and family life rather than governance. The court became insulated, cut off from the realities of urban hardship and rural desperation. Advisors who reinforced the Tsar's worldview were favored. Those who warned of danger were ignored. Within this closed environment, the health of the imperial heir emerged as a source of profound anxiety. The young Tsarevich Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a condition that made even minor injuries potentially fatal. The illness was hidden from the public, but its psychological impact on the royal family was immense. Fear and secrecy deepened their isolation and vulnerability. It was in this context that Grigory Rasputin entered the inner circle of the Romanovs. A Siberian peasant with a reputation as a holy man, Rasputin appeared to ease Alexei's suffering, whether through suggestion, coincidence, or genuine belief. To Empress Alexandra his presence seemed miraculous. To the court and the wider society, it was scandalous. Rasputin's influence became symbolic of everything critics despised about the regime's secrecy, superstition, and incompetence cloaked in spiritual authority. Rumors spread rapidly, amplified by newspapers and political enemies. Whether exaggerated or not, they eroded what little credibility the monarchy still possessed. The imperial family's refusal to distance itself from Rasputin reinforced perceptions that the state was no longer governed by reason. As domestic tensions simmered, Europe moved steadily toward catastrophe. Nationalism, alliances, and military planning converged into a system primed for war. When conflict finally erupted in 1914, Russia entered the World War I with a sense of obligation and misplaced confidence. The empire believed war would unite society, silence dissent, and restore loyalty to the crown. Initially, patriotic enthusiasm swept the country. Demonstrations of support filled public squares, and opposition voices fell temporarily silent. Yet beneath the surface, Russia was dangerously unprepared. Its industry could not supply the army adequately. Its transportation networks were overstretched, and its leadership remained divided and indecisive. Military setbacks came quickly. Poor coordination, inadequate equipment, and catastrophic losses undermined morale at the front. Soldiers fought bravely, but courage could not compensate for systemic failure. As casualties mounted, faith in the state eroded further. The war, intended to stabilize the regime, instead magnified every weakness it possessed. In 1915, Nicholas II made a decision that would bind his fate directly to the outcome of the conflict. He assumed personal command of the Russian army. In doing so, he left the capital in the hands of Alexandra and a government widely perceived as ineffective and corrupt. The Tsar sought control. What he achieved was responsibility without capacity. From that moment forward, military failure was no longer abstract. It bore the face of the emperor himself. Each defeat, each retreat, each shortage at the front echoed back to the throne. The Romanov Dynasty, once shielded by distance and ritual, now stood exposed. By the winter of 1916, Russia was exhausted. Food shortages plagued cities, inflation eroded wages, and faith in leadership had collapsed across every social class. The monarchy still stood, but it stood alone, isolated from its people, its institutions weakened, its authority questioned not in secret, but openly. The empire had entered a war it could not sustain, led by a ruler who could not adapt. The unraveling was no longer slow. It had become inevitable. By the beginning of 1917, the Russian Empire was no longer held together by loyalty or belief, but by inertia. Institutions continued to function because they had not yet stopped, not because anyone trusted them. The monarchy still existed in form, but its authority had become hollow. Power, once unquestioned, now depended on obedience that was no longer guaranteed. The winter was severe even by Russian standards. In the cities, food shortages worsened into daily crises. Bread lines stretched for hours, often ending with empty shelves. Inflation rendered wages meaningless, and coal shortages left factories idle and homes cold. These were not isolated inconveniences. They were systemic failures that reached into every household. The war consumed resources faster than the state could replace them, and the administrative apparatus proved incapable of managing scarcity on a national scale. In Petrograd, frustration turned into action. What began as spontaneous protests over food rapidly escalated into mass demonstrations. Workers walked out of factories, women marched through the streets demanding bread, and slogans shifted from economic grievances to political condemnation. The cry was no longer for relief, but for change. The government's response followed a familiar pattern. Troops were ordered to restore order. Yet this time, the calculation failed. Soldiers, many of them peasants in uniform, shared the same hunger and despair as the demonstrators. When commands came to fire on crowds, hesitation replaced discipline. Some units refused outright. Others turned their weapons away from civilians. In several cases, soldiers joined the protests instead of suppressing them. This breakdown of military obedience marked a point of no return. Autocracy depended on force, and force depended on loyalty. Once that loyalty fractured, the state had no remaining mechanism to assert control. The streets of Petrograd became ungovernable, not through coordinated revolution, but through the collapse of authority itself. As chaos spread, the political elite scrambled to respond. Members of the Duma, long marginalized and constrained, recognized that the moment they had feared and anticipated had arrived. They formed a provisional committee, claiming responsibility for restoring order and governance. At the same time, workers' councils Soviets re-emerged, reviving the organizational structures first seen in 1905. Two centers of power began to form simultaneously, neither fully legitimate, both responding to necessity. Far from the capital, Nicholas II remained detached from events unfolding in his name. His attempts to return to Petrograd were delayed and obstructed by mutinous railway workers. Reports reaching him were incomplete, contradictory, and filtered through officials unwilling to confront reality. The emperor who once ruled an empire of millions found himself increasingly isolated, physically and politically. Pressure mounted from all sides. Military leaders warned that the front could not withstand continued instability at home. Politicians argued that the survival of the state required the removal of the Tsar. Even members of the imperial family urged abdication as the only means of preventing total collapse. The belief that Nicholas II could still restore order evaporated rapidly. On March 2, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. The act was brief, almost administrative in tone, devoid of ceremony. In relinquishing power, he ended more than his own reign. He ended a dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final stand. The Romanov monarchy simply ceased to exist. The abdication did not bring clarity or peace. Instead, it exposed a vacuum. Authority passed nominally to the provisional government, but legitimacy remained fragile. The war continued. The economy remained broken, and social divisions deepened. The old order had fallen, but nothing stable had replaced it. For the Romanovs themselves, abdication marked the beginning of a new and dangerous chapter. Stripped of power, they became symbols without protection, figures whose fate would be shaped not by law or tradition, but by the volatility of revolution. The crown was gone. What remained was uncertainty. History often frames revolutions as moments of liberation or betrayal. In reality, they are moments of acceleration, when long-ignored problems converge into irreversible outcomes. February 1917 was not the end of Russia's crisis. It was the moment when collapse became visible to all. The abdication of Nicholas II ended the Romanov Dynasty, but it did not immediately resolve the question of its fate. In the days that followed March 1917, the former imperial family entered a condition that was unprecedented in Russian history. They were no longer rulers, yet they were not ordinary citizens. They existed in a legal and political limbo, symbols of a fallen order whose presence alone carried enormous risk. The provisional government faced an impossible dilemma. Allowing the Romanovs to leave Russia could turn them into living rallying points for counter-revolution abroad. Executing or imprisoning them outright risked igniting public outrage and delegitimizing a government already struggling to assert authority. The solution chosen was containment, physical isolation, paired with the hope that time would diffuse their significance. Initially, the family was placed under house arrest at Alexander Palace, their former home near Petrograd. The surroundings were familiar, but everything else had changed. Guards replaced courtiers, schedules replaced autonomy, and every movement was observed. The rituals of monarchy were stripped away, leaving behind the quiet reality of confinement. For Nicholas II, captivity was a profound psychological rupture. Power had defined his identity since birth. Without it, he retreated into routine walking, reading, tending to small tasks seeking structure where none remained. Alexandra, already emotionally fragile, experienced captivity as humiliation and divine trial. She interpreted suffering as proof of righteousness, a belief that hardened her detachment from political reality. Their children experienced the transition differently. Isolated from the outside world, they clung to family life with remarkable resilience. Lessons continued. Chores were assigned, and daily schedules imposed a fragile sense of normalcy. Yet the walls around them were no longer symbolic. They were real, guarded, and closing in. As months passed, the political situation deteriorated. The provisional government failed to deliver peace, land reform, or economic stability. Authority eroded further, while radical factions gained influence. By the summer of 1917, it became clear that Petrograd was no longer safe for the Romanovs. Their presence in the capital posed too great a risk amid growing unrest. The decision was made to relocate the family eastward, away from political centers and potential rescue attempts. In August 1917, they were transported to Tobolsk, deep in Siberia. The journey itself underscored their vulnerability. Once surrounded by imperial guards and ceremony, they now traveled under the watch of revolutionaries and provisional authorities, dependent on a state that barely controlled itself. Tobolsk offered isolation rather than security. The former governor's house became their new residence, cold, remote, and cut off from meaningful contact with the outside world. Communication was restricted, news arrived sporadically, and rumors replaced certainty. The family's world contracted to the dimensions of their confinement. In November 1917, the fragile balance collapsed entirely. The provisional government was overthrown in the October Revolution, bringing the Bolsheviks to power. With this shift, the Romanov status changed fundamentally. They were no longer wards of a transitional government, but prisoners of a revolutionary regime that viewed them not as political liabilities, but as class enemies. The Bolsheviks inherited a country fractured by war and civil conflict. To them, the Romanovs embodied everything. The revolution sought to destroy autocracy, inequality, and imperial oppression. While there was no immediate consensus on what to do with the family, there was agreement on one point: their continued existence posed a danger. Control over the Romanovs tightened. Guards were replaced with more ideologically committed personnel. Restrictions increased. Personal belongings were confiscated, correspondence censored, and privileges withdrawn. The language of protection gave way to the language of custody. In early 1918, the family was moved again, this time to Yekaterinburg, a stronghold of Bolshevik authority in the Urals. The destination was deliberate. Yekaterinburg lay far from international borders, surrounded by hostile terrain, and firmly under revolutionary control. The Romanovs were housed in the Ipatiev house, grimly renamed the House of Special Purpose. By the time they arrived, the possibility of mercy had narrowed to almost nothing. Civil war loomed, foreign armies intervened, and counter-revolutionary forces advanced toward the region. In this environment, the Romanov family was no longer a problem to be managed. They were a threat to be eliminated. The transformation was complete. The rulers of an empire had become prisoners of a revolution that no longer believed in delay. The question was no longer whether their lives would be spared, but when history would decide their end. By the spring of 1918, the fate of the Romanov family had narrowed to a single address. The Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg was not a palace, nor even a prison in the conventional sense. It was a private residence, converted into a place of final containment, stripped of symbolism, and renamed with bureaucratic coldness. The House of Special Purpose signaled intent without explanation. What it concealed was no longer uncertainty, but preparation. Yekaterinburg itself had become a frontline city in a country tearing itself apart. The Russian Civil War was not yet fully formed, but its outlines were unmistakable. Revolutionary authority was contested from every direction. Anti-Bolshevik forces advanced from the east, foreign intervention loomed, and the rail lines that once unified the empire now carried competing armies. In such conditions, decisions were no longer guided by legality or tradition, but by fear, speed, and survival. Inside the house, daily life followed a rigid, degrading routine. Windows were painted over to prevent outside contact. Guards enforced silence and curfews. Personal belongings were reduced to necessities. Even language was controlled. The family was no longer addressed by titles, names were discouraged. This was not cruelty for its own sake, but a systematic effort to erase identity to transform former sovereigns into anonymous detainees. Nicholas II adapted outwardly with discipline. He recorded weather, routines, and minor events in his diary, as though order might still be preserved through habit. Alexandra withdrew further into religious devotion, interpreting confinement as martyrdom. Their children, increasingly aware of danger, oscillated between resilience and quiet fear. Illness weakened Alexei, whose condition deteriorated under stress and inadequate care. The illusion of safety, however fragile, was fading. Outside the walls, authority over the house rested with local Bolshevik officials, whose autonomy grew as central control weakened. Moscow issued directives that were often vague, cautious, and delayed. The distance between command and action widened, leaving room for interpretation. In revolutionary Russia, interpretation could be lethal. The question of what to do with the Romanovs was debated in fragments rather than decrees. Some argued for a public trial, believing it would legitimize revolutionary justice. Others warned that such a spectacle risked rescue attempts or international backlash. As white forces moved closer to the Urals, the margin for delay collapsed. The presence of the Romanov family became a strategic liability. In this climate, responsibility diffused. No single document clearly ordered the execution, yet the system moved steadily toward that outcome. Authority functioned through implication rather than instruction. What mattered was not written command, but perceived necessity. Revolutionary power did not wait for consensus. It acted to prevent imagined futures. Guards were selected for ideological reliability. Alcohol was restricted, discipline tightened, and access to the family narrowed further. The house became quieter, more controlled, and more ominous. The routines continued, but they now carried the weight of anticipation. Even silence began to feel deliberate. On the night of July 16, 1918, preparations were finalized with administrative precision. There were no speeches, no proclamations. Orders were relayed verbally, framed as security measures. The family was told they would be moved for their own safety. The explanation was plausible enough to avoid resistance. In revolutionary Russia, relocation had become routine. Deception required no elaboration. History often assigns causation to ideology alone, but what happened in Yekaterinburg was also the product of collapse of institutions, of restraint, of accountability. The execution that would follow was not a spontaneous act of vengeance. It was the end point of a system that had lost patience, coherence, and fear of consequence. By dawn, the Romanov dynasty would no longer exist, not as a political force, not as a family, not even as a memory protected by distance. What remained would be silence, denial, and decades of uncertainty. The house of special purpose had fulfilled its purpose. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, history reached a point from which it would never retreat. What had unfolded slowly over decades through misjudgment, rigidity, fear, and collapse now compressed into a single night inside a confined space. The Romanov family, once the embodiment of imperial permanence, stood at the edge of history's most irrevocable threshold. Shortly after midnight, the family was awakened and instructed to dress quickly. They were told that fighting in the city made it unsafe to remain where they were, and that relocation was imminent. This explanation was neither unusual nor alarming in a country engulfed by civil war. The Romanovs complied without protest. Habit, not trust, guided their actions. Obedience had defined their lives. It did not abandon them at the end. They were led downstairs into a small basement room. Chairs were brought for Alexandra and Alexei. The space was narrow, its walls bare, its windows sealed. The family arranged themselves instinctively, parents near children, daughters close together. There was no ceremony, no declaration of charges, no reading of sentences. The absence of formality was itself revealing. This was not justice, revolutionary or otherwise. It was eradication. The execution squad entered. The command was brief. Shots followed immediately, echoing violently in the enclosed room. Confusion replaced precision. Smoke filled the air. Bullets ricocheted unpredictably. Some victims did not fall instantly. The brutality of the moment was not clean or efficient. It was chaotic, panicked, and irreversible. Violence replaced authority as the final instrument of history. When it ended, silence returned, not the silence of peace, but of conclusion. The Romanov dynasty had ceased to exist in physical form. No proclamation announced it. No monument marked the moment. The world would not know immediately what had occurred, only that the imperial family had vanished from record. The aftermath was marked by secrecy and denial. Bodies were removed under cover of darkness, transported, burned, buried, and reburied in an effort to erase evidence. Conflicting accounts emerged almost immediately. Some claimed the family had been relocated. Others insisted they were alive. For years, uncertainty clouded the truth. This ambiguity served political purpose. A dead symbol can be mourned, an uncertain one can still be feared. International reaction unfolded slowly. The chaos of war and revolution obscured verification. Rumors crossed borders, fueled by grief, hope, and conspiracy. Survivors were imagined. Imposters emerged. Myths flourished where documentation failed. The absence of immediate transparency transformed execution into legend. Within Russia, the act hardened revolutionary resolve. It closed the door to restoration definitively. No negotiation, no compromise, no symbolic reconciliation remained possible. The old world was not merely defeated, it was annihilated. The message was unmistakable: history would not turn back. Yet even in revolutionary logic, the execution introduced a fracture. The eradication of the Romanovs did not bring stability. It did not end war or suffering. Instead, it entrenched a culture of irreversible solutions, where elimination replaced governance. Violence, once normalized, would not retreat easily from Russian political life. The Yekaterinburg house would later be destroyed, its existence deemed too dangerous to preserve. Memory itself became contested ground. What should be remembered? What must be forgotten? The answers shifted with regimes, decades, and ideology. But the event itself remained immovable, unaltered by interpretation. History often seeks meaning in endings. But the end of the Romanovs offers no clarity, only consequence. Their deaths did not resolve the contradictions that destroyed them. They merely marked the point at which Russia severed itself from its imperial past completely, without transition or reconciliation. By the time dawn broke over Yekaterinburg, an empire that had once claimed divine sanction had been reduced to unmarked ground and unanswered questions. The crown was gone. The blood remained. The deaths of the Romanovs did not end Russia's suffering, nor did they conclude the revolution that claimed them. What followed was not resolution, but prolongation: years of civil war, famine, terror, and reconstruction under a new ideology that promised liberation yet relied on coercion. The Romanov dynasty vanished in a single night, but the consequences of its fall unfolded across generations. In the immediate aftermath, silence served power. The Bolshevik government avoided definitive statements, allowing ambiguity to obscure responsibility. This uncertainty was not accidental. In a fractured country, clarity could provoke backlash, while doubt delayed reckoning. For years, the official narrative shifted, constrained by politics rather than evidence. The fate of the imperial family became a shadow present, influential, but deliberately undefined. Outside Russia, the absence of proof fueled speculation. Rumors of survival circulated widely. Claims emerged that one or more of the imperial children had escaped. These stories endured not because they were credible, but because they were necessary. For monarchists, they preserved hope. For the public, they softened the brutality of reality. For history, they complicated truth. Inside the Soviet Union, memory was managed rather than examined. The Romanovs were portrayed as symbols of oppression, their deaths framed as historical necessity. Yet even within this narrative, discomfort lingered. The execution had crossed a moral threshold. It was one thing to dismantle a system, it was another to eradicate a family. The distinction mattered, even if it could not be acknowledged openly. As decades passed, archives closed and witnesses died, the event hardened into ideology. The Yekaterinburg house was demolished in 1977, not because it was structurally unsound, but because it remained too visible. Erasing the site was an attempt to control memory itself. Yet destruction rarely eliminates significance. It often confirms it. The collapse of the Soviet Union reopened questions that had long been sealed. Access to archives expanded. Investigations resumed. In the 1990s, remains discovered near Yekaterinburg were subjected to forensic and genetic analysis. The results confirmed what history had long suspected. The Romanov family had not vanished. They had been killed. With confirmation came reassessment. The Russian state, no longer bound by revolutionary legitimacy, confronted its imperial past with new complexity. In 2000, the Romanovs were canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church, recognized not as political figures, but as martyrs who endured suffering with faith. This act did not absolve their rule, nor did it condemn the revolution outright. It reframed the narrative from power to humanity. Canonization was not unanimity. It reflected a broader struggle over identity, over whether Russia should remember itself as an empire betrayed, a revolution fulfilled, or a nation perpetually suspended between extremes. The Romanovs became mirrors rather than answers, reflecting the values and anxieties of each era that revisited them. History resists simplicity. The Romanov dynasty was neither purely tyrannical, nor tragically innocent. It governed through absolute authority, suppressed dissent, and failed to adapt to modern realities. Yet its destruction did not produce justice or stability. It produced rupture. The price of the throne was paid, not only by those who wore it, but by a country that would spend the next century wrestling with the legacy of how power ends. The story of the Romanovs is ultimately not about monarchy alone. It is about belief in permanence in a world defined by change. It is about the danger of confusing authority with inevitability. And it is about the cost of endings that leave no room for reconciliation. Empires fall when they cannot reform. Revolutions fail when they cannot restrain themselves. Between these two failures lies the Romanov tragedy, a reminder that history does not judge intentions, only outcomes. The crown was heavy. The fall was absolute. And the silence that followed still echoes.